Step into the realm of the uncanny with Paranormal M, your gateway to the extraordinary. Subscribe now and enable notifications to uncover the hidden truths behind the unexplainable. Prepare to have your beliefs shook. My experiences. However, I've never seen ghosts. My first strange one was hearing my name being called in a direction I figured it came from the closet, but I didn't really think twice about it. It was small at the time, and, well, second experience, I was sitting playing on my computer, and I guess I felt a strange presence. I immediately felt the need to turn my computer screen off, and as I turned around, I felt, and also visually, my reality was quite literally melting. I was looking in the direction of the door. It opened about an inch with quickness. No longer felt the melting sensation. Not having processed what was going on, I sat there for a second, and then my fight or flight response kicked in. Ran straight to the front door. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. I was thinking that I was just being ridiculous. I looked to the left in general while thinking ghosts aren't real. The cat was looking up in the direction next to me while she was under the table. I recalled them not really noticing anything strange, and within no time, a very loud bang hit the table. I ran out of the house, fast as fuck. Went across the street and didn't come back till my parents got home. My third experience. Again, I felt a presence and said, "All right, I'm turning it off." Turned the monitor off again this time, and I think I may have turned the computer off. Slid my chair back away from the computer. Within the top corners of the room, I heard a crack, as if there was pressure, I guess. A crack sound or creak was happening within each wall, but not at the same time. Don't recall my thoughts, but I know I felt fear. So, as my brother was asleep in his bed, I crawled up onto the floor next to the bed closest to him in the fetal position. I'm guessing I went up to sleep. Dream or not, I somehow woke up in my bed. What I recall being a dream, I guess. I remember being carried to the door of my room. As I was standing before the door, which was closed, I heard whispers. A lot of whispers. I hesitated as I feared the unknown, but I felt very tired. So I went in, leapt into the bed face first, went to sleep. Another experience, me and my friend were hanging out in my room and heard my mother's voice yelling my name from the kitchen. So I'm thinking she just got home. Me and my friend walked quickly to see what she wanted. When we got in there was no one. Asked my friend, "So you heard that too?" Dude was freaked the fuck out, left in a hurry. I just continued my day, felt good about experiencing the unknown. And another experience. As I was laying on my bed, as soon as I touched my genital, quite literally I heard a buzz come from the AC, which wasn't on. My phone rang at the same time. As I go to answer the phone, the very second before I even touch it, the phone call ends. I look at my call history, and there's no evidence of a phone call being made. So I've never seen a ghost or a demon. What are your experiences? What do you think this could be? Lots of laughs. Would like to add that the air pressure or whatever can open a door if it's not all the way shut. And walls creak. But I mean, can it really cause a bang on the table? What is your table made out of? Because maybe. Shadow figures. I've had numerous encounters. The first time I ever saw one was in my childhood home. I'm assuming the neighborhood was built on an Indian burial ground. That's because the whole neighborhood was haunted. Not just inside, but outside as well. Nothing special about this encounter. They would stand in doorways and just watch. Everyone in the family would see them, so I know I'm not crazy. Second time was in the same house when I was a teenager. There's one called the Hat Man. Corny-ass name with even cornier stories behind him, but just bear with me. I woke up in the middle of the night. I had really bad sleep paralysis. I would get it so often, so I know how to pull myself out of it. Looked over to my closet and I saw the Hat Man standing there watching. I didn't sense anything negative or positive. It's just like he was observing me. Anyways, I looked over and saw my exact words I said out loud. What the fuck? Then I just turned around and went back to bed. Haven't seen him since. I guess I embarrassed him. Third time was when I moved out at 17. Currently 20, so all of this wasn't long ago. I moved to a town in South Carolina called Jenkinsville. Literally only has 38 residents, and I was the only white boy there. There was more cows than people, so you would see them all over the property. The ones that stick out to me when I was just sitting in my car with my ex-girlfriend and we were just talking. Got a feeling that something was watching me, and I just figured it was a mountain lion, but I looked over to my porch and I saw through the window of my '68 Chevy truck a shadow figure that was darting away when I was looking at it. I would see them in my bathroom doorway as well. They were tall, they were skinny, with long arms. Sometimes their eyes glowed faintly in a dark red. Sometimes they didn't even have eyes. This one sticks out to me the most. Well, the following one. This one. My ex and I were in my room and we heard something walking beside the house into the front yard. It was a cinder block house with no insulation, so it was easy to hear outside. Thought it was just coyotes or mountain lions, so I grabbed my 40mm. Went outside to go check. When I looked over to the side of the house, I saw a shadow figure sort of run back beside the house. I know they can't hurt me, but what I do is I go looking around to see if it's still there. Fuck that shit. So I walked back inside, went to my bedroom. I was going to tell my girlfriend that it was nothing because I didn't want to scare her, but she told me she hears fast footsteps run from the front of the house past the side and into the woods. So I had to tell her. That one was weird. It was like 8 feet tall, like no others I've really seen, and I'm 6 feet tall. It didn't have long arms, but it was still skinny. It had a white aura around it, which I'd never seen before. I now live in Florida in a nice little gated community. Haven't seen one since. I'm planning on going back to South Carolina here soon and visiting my old house at nighttime. I'll see if I can catch one on camera. I caught one in like a picture only one time, and unfortunately I don't have that phone anymore. But if I ever get it back from my ex, I will be glad to post it in this thread. My biggest regret is not taking a picture of the one with the hat. I just honestly didn't give a fuck that he was there and just wanted to go back to bed. From my experience, they aren't negative, but they aren't positive either. They just observe and watch. Only a few are negative, but none are necessarily positive. I'm not some batshit spiritual alien-believing weirdo either. I'm just a normal kid that goes fishing and has to fix my truck every 2 weeks because it's a shitbox. Believe if you want to, or don't believe. I could care less about either because these are personal experiences, not your own experience. I know what I've seen, and I know what I've felt. My childhood imaginary friends. So I can only remember one time hanging out with these imaginary friends. And the older I get, the more freakishly strange it is. A lot of this is small tidbits my mom told me, so pardon me if the details are blurry. From the ages of 4 to 7, I had 2 imaginary friends, both boys, even though I'm a girl. They appeared around when I first moved into my new home 14 years ago. As a child, I was completely unaware and uninformed of many things' history. I had no clue what the Civil War was, or a clue about the uniforms. Yet the first friend was a 10-year-old boy wearing a Confederate uniform. He didn't ever have any opinions related to the Civil War, but it was the exact uniform. He was always kind, and apparently, I would talk to him in the car until we left that neighborhood. The second boy was Native American, wore a very traditional outfit and had very traditional hair, and could be maybe roughly 11. Once again, I was 4. I had not learned about much yet, and I had just begun being quote-unquote conscious. The second boy had more of a stern personality. When I got in trouble, my mom remembers me trying to explain myself to him. I don't know why these were the people who became my imaginary friends, but something deep down tells me they weren't really imaginary. I live in a very haunted city, but my house doesn't have any history or death, but it is kind of it has a past haunted forest. They're claiming a past history of death, but it is in a past hunting forest. Maybe it's a haunted forest that has been recognized in the past, or maybe it's past some kind of hunting forest. Nonetheless, there is a creek at the bottom of my street that I ventured into with friends that caused me to leave after feeling, intimately scared. Intimately scared. Yikes. Indeed, Gecko. I've also been in the house where I've been saved. If anybody wants me to go into more detail, I will. Raise his hand. Scary experience in the Australian bush. For some background, I grew up involved in scouting, left around the age of 15. I've recently become involved again as a leader, and I'd forgotten about my experiences camping in rural Australia. That was until revisiting a campsite. I was reminiscing on some scary stories. I figured I would share it here and potentially get some insight on what this may have been. So, I was about 13 or 14 at the time. I'd gone on a camping trip with my troop. We went to a campsite we stayed at often. It was only about 30 minutes away from our city. It was large and open, and was to account for many scouts, as it acted as sort of a hub for my state's combined activities. All the groups would attend here, but this particular camp was only for our group, which consisted of 10 to 12 people. We set up camp in a back corner of the campsite, which was backed by a fence and thick trees. That led to a cliff overlooking a river if you walked far enough. We arrived around 6 p.m., set up camp, and basically went straight to bed. It's fairly consistent in my area that asking 11 or 15-year-olds to set up camp takes far longer than it should, and we were pretty tired. In the center of the campsite was a large toilet block surrounded by rocks and separated into 4 sections: male, female, adult, and youth. Our campsite was probably about 300 or so meters from this block. The first 2 nights went without incident, but it was our 3rd night that something occurred that left myself and 2 others with a sleepless night and an apprehension to camping there again. It was 3 to a tent. We all kind of just hopped into our sleeping bags for the last night before heading home. The others were in the tent. We'll call them Olivia and Jess for privacy reasons. They dozed off fairly quickly, but it took me a bit longer. I've always struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep, so when I seemingly randomly woke not long after nodding off, it wasn't a huge shock. Nothing seemed amiss at first, so I closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep once again. It only took a few seconds for me to hear footsteps walking toward the toilet block. We were camped on an area of lush green grass that scrunched under your feet, and the sound of somebody walking was distinct in the quiet night. I thought it was strange I hadn't heard a tent zipper, but brushed it off. A few minutes later, I heard them approaching. Still a normal course of events. Until the footsteps stopped outside of our tent. I looked over and both Olivia and Jess were sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't one of them. Waited a few seconds, and they continued moving, so again I figured it was strange, but I brushed it off. It then sounded as though the footsteps looped around the group of the tents and back to ours. The other side this time. The tents were set up in a line with a fair amount of distance between to account for the, guy ropes' wind had been forecast. Excuse me. But on this night, the wind was almost non-existent. The person or thing had seemed to walk around the whole line to stop back at ours again, which was second closest to the toilet block in a line of 4. I then heard them walk toward the tree line. I sat up, trying to listen as closely as I could, and at this point I wasn't sure if it wasn't one of us. The behavior of the footsteps was too strange. And why on earth would they have sounded like they were walking into the trees? I think it was close to 2 a.m. at this point. I had had enough of being alone experiencing this. Gently shook Olivia awake. Shushing her, she stirred. Olivia was my closest friend in the group. I whispered a quick explanation of what I had heard to her. We agreed to wait a while, see if anything else happened. Quite a few minutes passed. I don't remember how many, and the weirdness of the situation had started to wear off. I was about to suggest trying to fall back asleep when the footsteps seemed to return from where they had left and again stopped behind her tent. Olivia and I shared a look in the dim light of the moon. I could tell that she was as unsettled as I was. We heard them begin slowly circling around the tent, and she silently moved to huddle next to me. Bit by bit, the footsteps began to quicken. That was until they seemed to break into a run. Whoever, or whatever it was, had expertly dodged our guys' ropes to move at that speed without tripping. Every now and then, something would brush the sides of the tent. That was as Olivia and I were holding each other, doing our best not to make a noise. It was at this point that Jess woke up and groggily asked, "What the hell's going on?" She looked over at us, tears forming in her eyes, shot up, terror crossing her face. She silently moved over to us, joined us in our little terror-filled huddle. Her question didn't seem to faze whatever was making the noise. The sprinting went on for what felt like ages, but in reality was probably only a minute or so. That was until they stopped in front of our tent again. I slowly reached for a spare tent peg and gripped it as tight as I could, thinking that in a pinch it would do as some kind of weapon. The footsteps slowly did their wrap around the tents again. That was before stopping behind ours, then retreating back to the tree line. With some insane burst of courage and morbid curiosity, I decided to try to take a look outside. Still gripping my tent peg, I slowly unzipped our tent, trying to be soundless as possible. The fly unzipped from the bottom, so I laid down, peeked underneath, rather than unzip it, and then potentially create more noise. The footsteps had seemed to stop shortly after the retreat, and there were no further noises. This would mean that the person would have had to get over the wire fence without a sound, which didn't seem plausible, but I saw absolutely nothing. Needless to say, the 3 of us didn't get any sleep that night. And when recounting the story to our leaders that morning, we were told that we probably heard a possum or some other animal. An explanation I simply do not buy. None of the other campers had heard anything. Some of the strangest parts of this experience to me are that there were no other sounds other than the footsteps and the occasional brushing of the tent. No heavy breathing or spoken words or even animal noises. The person or thing seemed to disappear when I went to look. And the targeted and odd nature of that behavior. Why was our tent targeted? Had somebody been looking for a target, and when I woke it chose us? Why did it leave after scaring the ever-living daylights out of a group of teen girls? Why hadn't anybody else heard anything? Our tents were decently spaced apart for the guys' ropes, so it's plausible that the noise was harder to hear for other campers. Maybe not enough to wake them, but the sound seemed fairly loud to us. This experience comes from a national park in New South Wales. It'll be a long one, so buckle in. Firstly, I figured I would share a brief history of the area. I'm unsure how relevant any of it is to my experiences, but if it'll help with identifying what this could have been, I've been trying to do research about Australian cryptids and creatures. Anything that has any connection to the land that I haven't found. Anything that fits what I've experienced. This national park encompasses a subalpine mountain range, commonly has snowfall during the winter. The traditional owners of the land are the Ngunnawal people, their presence being associated with the land for over 21,000 years. However, the Ngambri people are also recognized for their traditional relationship with the land. One of the most beautiful spots to visit is an area where you can see rock paintings dating back to over 800 years ago that was painted here by the Aboriginal peoples. Contained in this national park are also a number of historic homesteads built by European settlers. It also hosts one of the satellite dishes commissioned by NASA to assist with the Apollo space station. Well, the Apollo space program. If you live in the area, you may know the national park I'm talking about. This place is full of history. And as such, whenever visiting myself and my companions, I've always been careful to respect the deep history contained in the land. Now that my history lesson is out of the way, on to the story. Within this national park, there are many different campsites and walking trails, fire trails, roads, and a variety of stunning sights to witness. Over the years, I've been lucky to experience much of this place. I enjoy going back whenever I can. However, I now carry a few experiences with me that continue to unnerve me. The first experience I had was at a fairly secluded campsite on one of the mountains. It was fairly open, but as the mountain stretched upwards, the trees began to sort of thicken. This small campsite housed a fire pit and a long drop toilet. I believe in other places these are referred to as an outhouse or pit latrine. We would normally set up our tents uphill and our kitchen below, close to the fire pit. This camp was no different. Well, no different than any other camp that we had spent here. The campsite was always quiet, as if it was generally only booked out to one group of campers at a time. This always brought an odd mix of comfort and peace, along with the eeriness and a sense of being unwelcome. This campsite in particular makes me feel as though there are always eyes on me. On this camp, we spent our days cooking on the fire, completing badge work and goofing around as young teens do. I would guess this particular camp was around 2015 or 16. We were all still able to entertain ourselves without the pull of technology. I don't want to sound all, "these young'uns," on you, but somebody barely in my 20s now, and this being not even a decade ago, but in my experience coming back as a leader, it can be difficult now to drag the kids away from their devices. We spent our afternoon and evening playing what we called real-life Call of Duty. It was very loosely based on the real thing, completely unrelated, but something I find oddly interesting of my time growing up with technology but not being attached to it. It's that we were able to disconnect from it, but sort of having it still be an integral component of our upbringing. I find this game the perfect example of how I feel. The rules of the game are somewhat relevant, so I'm going to briefly outline them, but if you want to skip over them, I feel like I'll still make sense. Real-life Call of Duty. The rules. 1. You must split into 2 teams. Select an area for a home base. 2. Your team must construct a structure out of sticks, leaves, and any other natural materials that are already lying on the ground, so not still attached to a living plant. 3. Once your structure is built, the game begins. 4. Players use sticks on the ground to act as guns. Prior to the game, there is always a complicated and somewhat heated discussion as to what size stick was what type of weapon. Usually it devolved into arguments about branches, colors, and any other characteristics somebody wanted to argue about, but a conclusion would be met, and each type of stick was assigned a weapon type. 5. Smaller wooden sticks and objects, and anything vaguely small and chunky was classed as a grenade, and players could carry one at a time. 6. The objective was to destroy the other team's home base without getting shot, which would occur when one of the grenades was thrown or like somebody pointed their gun at you and said, pew. When this occurred, you'd have to go back to your base and respawn. 7. You could only destroy the base by throwing your grenades or hitting it with your stick. 8. A team won either when the other team's base was unrecognizable and theirs was still standing, or when the leaders called us back to camp and more heated discussions would ensue about whose base held together better than the others. Typing that out felt a little bit silly, but also brought back wonderful memories. Memories like feeling like a kid, feeling unfortunately lost early into my teen years due to chronic illness. I hear ya. Now that we have the whole background story, which I promise is relevant, I can get into where it gets strange. Often we would play our game into nightfall, enjoying it more if it was somewhat dark. This particular night, we had our bases all built, but we had just began to get into the game when I started to feel eyes on me. Assuming I was about to turn and see a stick pointed at me, I gripped my own, spun to find an empty patch in within our game boundary. It was out towards the edge of the set boundary, which wasn't very large. I could hear the others making pew noises and arguing about who said it first. I continued moving, thinking my spidey senses were off, headed for the observation base. I managed to throw a lump of bark at it before getting sent back to a respawn. My strategy was to move along the edge of the boundary and try to stay hidden in the bush and sneak attack at my first opportunity. I did manage to stay hidden, but felt eyes on me no matter where I moved. In the thick of the game, that was to be expected with so many people running around chaotically. But out of the boundary where nobody else was trudging, made me feel uncomfortable. Kept creeping toward my enemy, trying to stay as quiet as possible, when I heard crunching leaves behind me. I turned to find out whether it was a friend or foe, but again, I saw nothing. I was creeped out, but brushed it off as there was so much going on around me I figured I must have misheard it. That is, until I felt somewhat hit pretty hard on my back. I let out a small ow. Turned, ready to be mad at whoever it was that threw it and hit me so hard, and you guessed it, I found nobody there once again. I looked down at my feet to see a small rock sitting on the top of the dry leaves. Very clearly the object that had hit me moments ago. It seemed as if it had disturbed the leaves and sat perfectly on top of them. Rocks were an absolute off-limits item for this game. I mean, sure, we were emulating a violent video game, but our intentions were never to actually hurt anyone. Now more than ever, I felt watched. Decided I'd had enough of the game, began walking back to camp. I stuck to the edge of the boundary once again, so as to not have anybody else involved in the game. The whole walk back was agonizing, constantly looking over my shoulder expecting to find somebody there. When I returned to the campsite after what felt like the longest hike of my life, I was questioned by the leaders as to why I wasn't playing anymore. I didn't want to explain for fear of being disbelieved. See my first story, which they explained away as an opossum. Oh, we heard it. Maybe I'd be getting the group in trouble with an interrogation, trying to figure out who threw the rock. But I knew in my soul that it wasn't one of us. So I just told them I got bored of it and tried to brush it off. The others continued playing for another 20 or so minutes before returning. We all sat around the campfire winding down for the night. I could not shake off the feeling of being watched. My whole body was screaming danger, but I did everything in my power to calm it. At the campfire, we played little word games and told stories. Thankfully, none of the scary kind, at least that night. Not sure I could have handled it at the time, and as kids started to go off to bed, it got quieter and quieter around the fire. I focused in on the calming and soothing crackling and humming of the flames. I bathed in its warmth as conversations drifted in and out of my ears. I was starting to feel calm again. That was when a shrill squeal sounded out across the quiet night. We all jumped a mile, looked around frantically as a few other scouts emerged from their tents to investigate this noise. It sounded animalistic and unnatural at the same time. I saw confusion on most of the faces around me. Even the leaders for a split second before they seemed to snap back to reality where they had remained irrational. They explained that there's wild pigs in the region, and that was probably the likely explanation for this sound. I didn't believe it for 1 second. Didn't sound like any kind of wild pig screams I'd heard before. This was not natural. It was the same cadence as something in pain, but something was just off about it, as if something was mimicking the sound. Kind of like those uncanny valley voice recordings, almost. Although, based on my already spooked nature, I'm willing to take on board that it may have just been unsettled already and had pushed me over the edge. That was enough to send us all to bed, but not before reassuring some of the more wild animal-fearing scouts that any wild pigs in the area wouldn't be visiting our campsite to wreak havoc. I struggled to sleep that night, plagued with odd dreams that I wouldn't exactly call nightmares, but they certainly weren't pleasant. I spent the rest of the camp looking over my shoulder and jumping at every small sound. I avoided being alone like the plague, and other than the feeling of being watched, even as we drove away after packing up, nothing else really significant happened. This area is kind of one that I've had many odd occurrences at, but it's also an area I feel a deep connection with. If you ask me about my favorite spots to go camping, this national park would definitely be in the top 3. Something about it is so damn peaceful. It's also pretty full of energy. Haven't been able to visit since it was affected by the Black Summer bushfires in 2020, where over 200,000 acres of land totaling over 80% of the park was destroyed. I look forward to going back soon, but hope I don't run into anything like this story. More Australian bush stories. This story didn't happen to me, but I was a witness to it, and I think it's one of the most fascinating things I've seen occur out in the bush. We were camping in a more populated campsite, which had designated sites to book. This is called the Honeysuckle Creek Campsite, and it's gorgeous. It's the perfect spot to camp to walk to the satellite used to assist in the Apollo space mission. We set up on a Friday night, and as we usually did, and everything went pretty smoothly. On the Saturday morning, a group of 20-something guys arrived and set up at a campsite across from us. Their site housed a sheltered area with a fire pit. More so like an open oven-style fire than a fire pit, but I'm not sure what you'd call it exactly. We weren't exactly quiet, or rather they weren't. They were somewhat rowdy, but not to the point where it was bothering us. As the sun started to set, they began to amp up, playing loud music from their speaker, drinking beer and throwing the empty bottles into the trees. Still, they weren't loud enough to really bother us, so we left them to it. As they got their fire going, they took a large log, more like a big chunk of a tree, and sat it by the fire. It was so big that more than half of it was hanging out of the fire pit and resting on the ground. This is very much against the law in Australia. We have very strict fire laws for obvious reasons, and one of the laws states that any fires must be contained to designated fire pits. If a ranger had a witness of their setup, they would have faced a hefty fine. None of us were keen on disturbing the group, so we left them to their own devices. While their fire setup wasn't exactly safe, it wasn't currently causing problems. We all slowly filtered off into our tents. We were all in bed by around 10:30 or 11. I could still hear them throwing their bottles and goofing around and pumping their music. Again, while it was slightly annoying, it wasn't bothering any of us enough to go over and say anything. I've also had trouble falling asleep. I've always had trouble falling asleep and only do so now with the help of strong medication. So as usual, I was still struggling to fall asleep. I'd say it was around 12 when things started to get weird. All of a sudden, the whole group went silent. I heard one of them say, "Did you guys hear that?" I heard mumblings from the others, but it seemed like they were brushing it off. They continued on as normal, maybe even a little bit quieter than before. Not long after, I heard another, shh, guys, what is that?" More mumbling from the group followed, and then a loud crack came from somewhere around the campsite. It was louder than a normal twig snap, but still sounded like some kind of a branch breaking. The next thing I heard was, "Fuck this, I'm gonna go and take a look." And then heavy footsteps and dry leaves. Soon I heard faster, more hurried footsteps returning, crunching leaves and branches, and the same voice say, "Guys, what the fuck was that? I saw something standing in the trees." The person began to describe what they saw, but I only heard bits and pieces as the wind started to pick up. Tall, dark, creepy were the words that I caught. They were hurriedly discussing what was going on. That's when I heard a faint laugh. Going to assume it wasn't one of any of them because one of them said, "Fuck this, I'm not staying here," and then were arguing. The last thing I heard before the wind was far too heavy to hear anything over it was, "Fine, if we're staying, then I'm sleeping in my car." The car door opened, slammed shut. I think the others continued talking for a while, but at this point the wind was so loud you could have sworn you were camping right on a beach listening to the waves crashing. And I did eventually drift off. I felt odd after hearing all of that go down, but I felt safe. Nothing felt negative towards me and my campsite. The next morning I was leading duty patrol, the patrol responsible for cooking of that meal. And I got up around 6, and I promised my patrol members that they could sleep until 6:30, so I figured I'd start warming the barbecue and prepare little things until then. When I emerged from my tent and looked over to the other campsite, I was met with a sight I'd never forget. Everything that they had left out was strewn about, rubbish all around, belongings scattered. Even their solar panel was lying face down in the grass. Assuming it was the heavy wind, I looked around my campsite trying to find anything amiss. I didn't see anything. Cups were left on our tables where they were the night before. Bits and pieces from the kitchen were all in their places. Thinking that was strange, I glanced over at their campsite again. The fire pit was full of soft dirt and a log was still hanging out of it. Something that was kind of odd, but potentially could have been them. It's kind of an uncommon way to put out a fire, but not so uncommon that this is 100% part of the paranormal aspects. What was strange, however, was the pile of empty beer bottles neatly arranged on the ground next to the fire pit. Thought it was all pretty odd, but I continued about my duties. That was until 6:30 I went to go get my patrol members from their tents. That was when the man who slept in his car emerged from the back seat. He looked around the campsite and said, "Nah, bro, what the actual fuck?" Woke up all of his companions. They all looked around as the car guy was ranting about how messed up the situation was, urging them all to leave. As they were looking around, another noticed something on the car. "Bro, look." He was pointing at the iced-up windshield. "Are those handprints? I'm leaving." So if you're wondering if this much swearing is embellished, I urge you to remember that we're all in the Australian bush, and these were all 20-somethings wearing akubras and work boots. The boys packed up camp mighty fast. They were all out of there in under an hour. Nothing happened to us the entire time, and this honestly gives me a bit of a laugh thinking back on it. I truly think they upset something out there, and it gave them a strong message. Why am I the only one that hears the knocks? Today I was in my living room. I was being very still and quiet while I was listening to the TV. That was as my 21-month-old was napping. Two of my dogs were in the living room with me, one napping on the couch and the other was curled up with me in the recliner, napping on my lap. My third dog was out front. And before I explain what happened, I feel I need to explain the setting of my yard. I live in the woods. My front yard is literally just trees. You'd never know my house is here unless you came up the driveway. There's a gate at the bottom of the driveway to enter my property. Then at the top of the driveway, there's an additional gate to get into my front yard. The gate to my yard is always closed. It's to keep dogs from roaming the street. And today was no different. So okay, back to the story. Just sitting there with my dogs very quietly when 5 very loud, rapid knocks jolted me from my chair. The knocks were so loud and sudden that my heart skipped a beat and my stomach dropped. My immediate thought was, how did anybody get on my porch? My second thought was, wait, what the fuck, none of the dogs reacted? I got up and looked through the peephole. Nothing. All I saw was my big outside dog napping in the dirt. If someone was out there knocking, the last thing any of my dogs would be doing is napping. And yet, all of them were. They never even budged. My big kids, being 16 and 13, were also home. But they were on the other side of the house in their rooms. My son was on his PlayStation, my daughter was studying for her ACT. The way my house is set up is there's no way that they could have gone outside, back in without me knowing. There's not the type of people that prank people anyway. My family's lived in this house for going on 6 years. We started experiencing activity almost right away. My daughter was always saying that she feels like somebody's watching her from the closet, which is creepy as fuck. My son feels things as well. Poltergeist activities occurred, opening cabinets and drawers. However, nothing like this has ever happened where somebody was isolated to the event like I was today. I was the only one experiencing it. Has this ever happened to anybody else, or am I just a loony? A weird, unexplained experience with missing time almost 50 years ago. When I was 8 years old back in the mid-1970s, I was in the Scouts. Me and my sister and my parents lived in a house in a quite safe suburban neighborhood just south of Stockholm, Sweden. It was only about a 20-minute walk from my house to the Scouts group facilities, so I usually walked there or rode my bike. The evening this event took place, I'd walked. About an hour and a half later at 8:30 p.m., I was on my way home. It was mid-October and dark outside at that time of year. I had to pass a large parking lot and closed gas station. Both were poorly lit. In the area, I was always finding it creepy. I hurried past it every time I came, just to this junction. This evening was no different. When I crossed the street, I was finally in my own neighborhood where I knew every tree, bush, stone, nook, and cranny, as kids do. I was walking on the sidewalk along the road leading up to a roundabout. Cars were passing by as usual, even though it wasn't really much traffic at that hour. And that's when it happened. As I took another normal step forward, it was like the entire world suddenly slowed down. Came to a complete stop in just a second. There was a sound that I would much later come to associate with a deep subwoofer THX sort of test sound at the cinema. You know, the one before the movie starts, if you know what I mean. I experienced tunnel vision, and it was completely silent. No cars, no people, no movement, no nothing. The entire situation couldn't have lasted more than 15 or 20 seconds tops. And then it was over just as sudden as it had begun. My left foot that had been frozen in midair for the entire time hit the ground. It was quite frightening yet extremely fascinating. First, I was just standing there stunned. And then, very cautiously, I took a step forward, but nothing happened except my sneakers got wet by stepping into a puddle of water. I suddenly realized that the rain was drizzling down and my clothes and hair were absolutely soaking wet. Only a few seconds before it had been like a clear and calm night, no visible stars. I did find the entire situation quite bizarre and I hurried home. I couldn't wait to tell all my parents what had happened. But as soon as I opened the door, I was met with both my parents in a sheer state of panic. They both asked in an angry tone where I'd been. I became perplexed and defensive, so I stuttered that I might have been to the Scouts. Then I went straight home. My mother pointed at the clock on the wall, told me to stop lying. The clock said 21:55. More than an hour had passed since I left the Scouts. I insisted over and over again that I'd walked straight home, and my mother got even more angry. She was, of course, extremely worried, but it came out as anger. But since I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet was unjustly accused of lying, I got really angry too. I think that caught my parents completely off guard because it was not the reaction they had expected at all. That's when my father turned to my mother and said, "I think he's telling the truth." I'll never forget that because I was so relieved. My mom looked completely bewildered, but stopped yelling and asked again, "But where have you been?" However, this time she was hugging me harder than she'd ever had before. When they realized I wasn't hurt or traumatized and behaved just as usual, my father told me that he walked the exact same route I took between the house and the Scouts facilities 3 times. He was repeatedly calling my name, and I simply wasn't there. They had called the parents of all the families, and they were in the process of calling the police when I stepped through the door. I simply couldn't believe it. They asked me more calmly this time if something had happened along the way, anything at all. I was just about to say that nothing had happened when I remembered the strange incident that I had completely forgotten about due to all the commotion. So, I told them exactly what I had described here above. They looked at me in a mixture of disbelief and fascination, and as far as I can remember, they didn't push it any further. Fact is, the whole situation wasn't really discussed until years later when me and my father talked about it again. I again insisted that things happened exactly like I had told him years ago, and he replied that he wanted to believe me, but the story was simply too fantastic to take in, even after all these years had passed. He said, "You were gone, son. as if you'd simply vanished from the face of the earth. You were missing for more than an hour. Where did that time go? Where did you go? Needless to say, I couldn't answer him. And even later, when my father had died, I talked to my mother about it, and to my surprise, she laughed. She said she always thought I'd been abducted by aliens, as a matter of fact. I'm 55 now, and I still can't make heads or tails of that incident. I never saw any strange lights or disc-shaped objects, but believe me, I really wish I had. That would at least have made some kind of sense. However, I truly hadn't got a clue what happened in that lost hour. All I know is that it happened exactly the way I told you now. I told my wife about it, but I never told anyone else. However, I did write the entire thing down the same night it happened, and so did my mom, I much later found out. So when I wrote this, I based it on both of these accounts. My experience with shadow people. I live in South Australia, and as a kid, around 7 or 8 years old, I woke up one night and I saw a silhouette figure in my bedroom staring at me. I was wide awake, thought this was my sister's friend at the time, because she was coming over more frequently on the weekend for sleepovers. But as I was waiting for a response from it, I realized it was still school week. Nobody had come over. The shadow looked solid short, had 2 pinpricks of light coming from where its eyes should have been. I was full of dread. It hadn't moved or faded away after my realization. Thought something bad might happen to me if I continued to look at it. Actually, I had to turn away from it to make it disappear. I had a lot of relief to see it gone, but ended up putting this off as my imagination afterwards. Cut forward a few years later. I'm 11 and living in a new house. This was my second encounter. At 12 p.m. I went downstairs to drink water, completely stopped when I reached the bottom. There was a shadow figure sitting up against the bottom of our white couch, I guess on the floor. And at the time, I knew that both my brother and his friend were at this sort of lounge because they were playing video games last time I went down. I think I knew something was off. I heard others say that there are many different types of shadow people, but I'm pretty sure this was the same one. Same body size, shape, and look in the eyes while staring back. I didn't feel anything this time, just confusion. Probably because I wasn't cornered in my room and this was sort of out in the open. Anyway, I walk off to get my drink, and when I come back, I was shocked to see that the figure was gone and that both brother and friend were fast asleep. I don't remember much after, just going up the stairs and probably went to sleep myself. My mom used to say that she could hear footsteps on the ceiling every night. She's terrified of ghosts or spirits. Even mentioned that she used to see a misty shadow leave me in my siblings' shared bedroom. It would open up the childproof gate and go downstairs. We used to get sent off to our dad's house on the weekend, but her fear was that bad that she used to leave one of us back home as a sacrifice, maybe. A lot of this stuff has been put off by myself, and I guess I thought something bad would happen if I acknowledged it fully. But this is what really did it for me. It's either 2020 or 2021, and I'm in a class with a friend for some reason. I brought some photos of me when I was young, showed them to her, and we started joking about how creepy they look. Out of nowhere, she mentions the house that I lived in when I was 11 and how haunted it was. At that point, I just let her explain herself to see what she had meant. She explains everything my mom was experiencing, but worse. She was apparently sleeping in her room when she woke up and saw a shadow mist everywhere. Something circling her, loud banging on the walls or the entire room. Said that she felt anger coming from the shadow, basically being harassed by it. No one else woke her up but her, despite the noise. This whole conversation just left me speechless because I never would have expected her to experience this. The fact I don't remember her ever being in her house or even visiting it really creeped me out. This made me reconsider stuff as I was 17 at the time, wondering if this is the same shadow entity, and if so, why does it appear differently to others? Now I'm 21. Family and I have been living in this new house for about a year now, and recently, my mom said she saw something walk into the bathroom and to her bedroom and shut the door. She mistook it for one of us. She was waiting outside of it and got impatient enough to open it up and saw no one inside. I had a chat with her boyfriend about it. He does believe in spirits. He woke up one time, saw one of these shadows all up in his face, freaked the hell out, told me he was living alone on a farm. It just seems this isn't as rare of an occurrence as I thought. I used to hear other kids in high school have their fair share of weird experiences, but either way, I'm not assuming anything. Dormitory Ghost. So this happened back when I was studying in a boarding school. This was in Toohypper, Tamil Nadu. I was in the 10th grade and we were in the middle of board exam preparation. So the girls' dormitory at our schools was one huge space divided into 4 sections, each for grades 9 to 12. The 9th graders had vacations and their dormitory section lights were off. That was while the rest of us still had school. So one usual night after our dinner, we got back to our dorms, and the akas, the ladies who work in the dormitories, they switched off the lights, got everybody to their beds, and left the dorm to go to their rooms. Me and friends were sneaked off into the 11th graders section to chit-chat with everybody. We were just having fun. Then suddenly there was this black bug on the floor that scared us. We were trying to trap the bug at the same time. We couldn't really see it properly since the dorm lights were off. We used our study lamps to catch it. So 2 girls were in the middle of doing that, and that's when they continued doing that, and I lifted my head for a second from the floor. I looked to the opposite side where I can see the 9th dorm, and all of a sudden I see this huge lady. And by huge, I mean huge. They were wearing a white nightgown. At least, that's what it looked like. Also had a pink scarf on her head. She was standing facing her back and not moving at all. At first, I was actually confused when I saw it. Then I just thought to myself, no way. I stared at it for 5 seconds more. I was hoping that it would just be an akka in the dorm, and then I realized all the akkas left the dorm and the 9th graders are on vacations. I immediately asked the other girls around me what it was. They had not noticed the lady until then. When they looked at it, they were just all shocked, and all of us were getting paranoid because we were looking at the study lamps and pointing at the lady and wasn't moving even then, just standing still, facing with her back to us. We had a couple of Thai friends who were with us at the time, and the moment they saw it, they just shut their mouths and hugged each other and sat. They knew that it was real. The Thai kids at school used to experience paranormal stuff a lot. I called my best friends who were talking in the washroom to come out and be with me. I was too scared. And that was when another girl who didn't see the lady yet got up confused, asking everybody what was happening. She took one look at it and screamed. We all started hiding since we were supposed to be asleep. We knew the akkas would come. Then they came from their rooms, asked what happened, why we were all out of our beds. We just made the excuse that there was a big bug. So our friend screamed because she was scared of that. The akkas switched on the dormitory lights, and when we looked at the 9th dorm room, the lady in white was gone. First ghost sighting at age 40. In my 20s, a few weird things happened at my mom's new house, like me hearing a woman's voice in the room behind me. That was while my mom was asleep on the other side of the house. My mom said it must have been her, but that would have defied physics. I also experienced feeling strange presences, which I brushed off as anxiety at being home alone in a big house at night when my mom and stepdad were out of town. I was living there in college. My aunt had always told me she'd seen a few ghosts in her lifetime, and I truly believed her, so I was a confused child. My uncle did too, but he was a notorious storyteller and attention seeker. In the past several years, I've become much more spiritual, and I've really understood the depths of the unknown and our limitations of understanding paranormal activity. Recently, my husband and I stayed at a hotel that was notoriously haunted. I was a little bit freaked out at the time, but not terribly. Figured I'd be safe even if I saw something. My husband doesn't believe in ghosts. We even stayed in a supposedly haunted room. Nothing really ever happened. One night we were walking around outside the hotel. It was around 10 p.m. near all these tables and chairs. There was a man dressed in a uniform walking purposefully back and forth like he was the last person closing down an event. He didn't look at us, but walked within 10 feet of us a few times while my husband and I chatted about the area. As we walked back into the hotel, I asked my husband if he had seen on the marquee what type of event had happened there earlier in the evening. He said he didn't know, asked me why I thought there had even been an event. Well, I said because we just saw that server walking around closing everything down. So, he asked me what I was talking about. I was flabbergasted because he's sometimes not very observant. But I knew there was no way he couldn't have seen this guy. He's walking back and forth right in front of us. And as I reflected later, I realized that I never saw the man actually doing anything, just walking back and forth purposely. My husband thinks he was just oblivious and didn't see the guy. But we also checked and found that there was no event in that space earlier. Does openness to spirituality affect one's ability to see ghosts? Does it seem possible that this happened to me? Yes. A spirit spoke through me. I haven't told many people about this experience, but it seems like this would be a good place to share. Indeed. This happened about 20 years ago when I was 14. My friend's mother was very into paranormal stuff in the whole world. And one night, we, being myself, my friend, her mom, and a few other friends, decided that we wanted to use their Ouija board. Oh boy. We turned off all the lights in the house, but lit a couple of candles on each side of the board, which we had sitting on their coffee table. So we all sat in a circle. That was while her mom told us a few rules about the board. Suddenly, my friend goes, "Let's do a seance." Her mom tells us to all join hands, and no matter what happens, do not break the circle. Her mom starts asking if there was anybody with us, if any spirits would like to communicate with us, etc. A few minutes went by and we hear a huge crashing sound come from my friend's room, followed by what sounds like people walking around in the bedroom. We all look at Laura, my friend's mom, and she yells out, "Hello?" Another loud crash and we hear somebody say, "Shh." Then all of a sudden my entire right side goes completely ice cold. Tears start streaming down my face. I have no idea why I'm crying. Look at my friend's mom and I say, "Everything will be all right, Laura." I lean in and blow out the candle that was sitting in front of me. Laura gasps, starts crying, and backs up from the table. My friend runs to turn on the light and she looks at me and says, "Why did you say your name like that?" When I say Laura, I pronounce it as Laura. But when I was talking to her, I said Laura. Or Laura. I think the last name Lowry. Laura. Got it. I told my friend I wasn't sure why I had done any of that. But it didn't feel like I was, in control for a whole minute. almost like somebody else was steering. She then tells me that I said her mom's name exactly like her mom's ex, Dale. That's how he used to say her name. Her mom told us that Dale was extremely abusive, even tried to kill her towards the end of their relationship. Dale was killed in a motorcycle accident 5 years before. We were so freaked out, and then my friend wanted to check her bedroom where she had heard the crashing sounds. When we walked into her mattress and box spring in a frame, they were all thrown around the room, and her nightstand was knocked over. I still get chills when I think about that night. Such a strange experience, and it definitely made me a believer. My friend that I live with died, and he's still here in the house. He was 75 and was in good health until he had a stent put in. In short, he passed away in August, and since then I've seen a white, wispy, see-through apparition go down the stairs. My dog saw it too, and she was barking. My roommate, who is his wife, saw an outline of what she describes as a man with broad shoulders. She thinks it may have been his wings, standing at the foot of the bed with the nightlight behind him. Same dog saw that as well. The dog woke up my roommate anyway, and she was still in sleep paralysis, wanted to scream but couldn't move. She felt a calm come over her, so she relaxed and fell back asleep. Then at around 3 a.m. I heard 3 loud booming footsteps, then heard my doorknob being grabbed. Each night I hear the footsteps, although it's not at the same time. Not sure what to make of all this, but the grabbing of my doorknob had me shoot up out of bed, got my full attention. Been trying to fall asleep when I heard it loud and clear. And what troubles me is that it felt like the hospice team of nurses were poisoning him. He even said as much to me. Looking up the drugs they gave him, it says that it's used as an antipsychotic. Not sure why a dying man would need it. The night he died, he threw his bottled water at me, soaking my shirt, and he was alive and lucid. Not what you'd expect somebody who is dying to look and act like. Any thoughts? From my experience, they do some horrible things in those places. So, I don't know. Disembodied singing and vocals at Lake George, New York. We stayed at Lake George Battlefield Campground. Our last night camping was Sunday, July 16th. That was in 2023. Right after midnight, my friends went to use the bathroom, left me alone by the fire. That's when I heard a woman's voice singing in the woods. It was spooky, but also dreamlike. I describe it as singing because it sounded so practiced, but it was sort of an arpeggiated note, no words. I would also describe it as sad and possibly ritualistic. Startled, I tried to record it because it was definitely audible. I figured if my ears can pick it up, so can a mic. No chance. I responded with vocals of my own, then asked who was there. No response. My friends returned about 10 minutes later and the singing stopped. That was as I heard their footsteps approaching from the road. They told me it was bullfrogs. The pitch changes and the length of the notes was no way a bullfrog or forest animal. And for reference, the campsite we stayed at was 200 feet south of the Isaac Jock's Monument. There's a nature trail about 400 feet west. It's down a hill from our site. In front of the nature trail is the Tiki Hotel. You can see those lights through the foliage. I'm only thinking it was someone practicing some Native American ritual. We've stayed at the same campsite every year for the past 5, but this is our first time staying into Monday morning. Would anybody know what goes on out there on Sundays? Minor paranormal event in broad daylight. This happened like an hour ago or so. I'm at my father's and decided to go to a restaurant for some breakfast. The place was packed, and on another level, every table had people at it. We sat down at this table that was completely surrounded by other tables. They were all packed with people. Got some coffee and were just waiting for the waiter to come by and ask for our order. I hadn't touched my coffee because it was super hot and I was just messing with my phone. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, thought I saw it move. I looked at it and it was just sitting there. Figured I'd imagined it. The waiter came by and I gave her our order. So I was just sitting there not really paying attention to anything. Then it moved again, but I just happened to be staring near it. It legit moved like a solid 6 inches across the table. I could hear it, and I saw it. I looked at my dad and asked if he saw it move. He said he hadn't because he was staring at his phone. Didn't seem to be bothered by my observation. Multiple times while eating, I would go to reach for it, and it would be slightly in a different place than where I thought I placed it. I've had other paranormal events, but they're usually audio ones. However, this is the first to actually just happen right in front of me. Broad daylight, surrounded by people. Probably not going to do anything about it, but just figured I'd tell the story here. If you're wondering, it was in the Perkins restaurant. It's at a bakery in Butte, Montana. Or Butte, B-U-T-T-E, Montana. Have any of you had a very public ghost or paranormal event happen to you? So over a year ago, I was at my father's for the weekend. And before he took me home, we went to a restaurant for breakfast. This was at the Perkins Restaurant and Bakery. It's in Butte, or Butte, I don't know how to say that, Montana. It was Sunday morning, probably 10 a.m., and it was packed. We walked in, and my father's first words were, "We might have to find somewhere else." We managed to get some seats. They were in the middle row of tables between 2 rows of booths to our right and left. We were at the very end of the line, right next to the door. The waitress comes by and we both get coffee. The coffee is hot as hell. That's pretty hot. Too much to even touch, which I learned by burning myself in the ceramic. Anyways, we're looking through our menus when something happens in the corner of my eye over the menus I'm holding. I look up, but I don't quite catch it. I just look back at the menu. The second I look back at the menu, something shifts again. So I look up. I watch as my full-to-the-brim coffee cup slides a solid 14 inches across the table. Wasn't super fast, probably took about 3 seconds to move the distance. Tripping all over myself. It's because of the extreme deja vu I'm experiencing. How about you guys? I didn't even know what to think, and to be honest, I thought it might have been magnets, but the table was solid. After drinking the coffee, it was clear it was a standard cast ceramic. I asked my dad if he saw it. He said he hadn't. Finished the meal without anything else happening, trying to contemplate what the fuck just happened. This is where the story gets interesting. Again, I will reiterate that this happened in front of me. It was on Sunday morning in a packed restaurant with packed booths to my right and left. Clear as day, bright as sunshine, because the window's to my right. Anyway, I went home and I lived with my grandmother at the time. She greeted me crying, saying that my Uncle Mike died that morning due to heart failure. Side note, I don't know if this is everywhere, but in Montana, the friend of your parent or grandparent is your uncle, even if they're not related to you. Mike was such a case. My grandmother and him had been friends for 40 plus years. I barely knew him. We spent some time together in my childhood, and I did some work on his property when I was 15, but other than that, he was just my grandmother's friend to me. I told her the story of what happened earlier that morning, and since she's a firm believer, she was rather comforted by it, but it left me with some questions. 1. If it was my uncle, why me? We didn't really know each other that well. Why would he seek to do something for me and not my grandmother or sister? 2. If it wasn't him, why would some random ghost be moving my stuff around in the middle of the day in a packed restaurant? Again, this wasn't some dot on a camera or some shadow in the corner of my eye. I watched the cup move. Eyes were on it for a solid 2 seconds. I've seen a lot of paranormal stuff, but none so blunt. But perhaps not as blunt as how I will end this. See ya.